Good morning. Good morning. Buenos dias. Wow, that was an introduction, huh? But there are other things you need to know. As a woman who lives in Nepantla, Nepantla is the Nahua word for the land in the middle. And as an immigrant child, I learned to cross borders early on. Not only borders of language, but borders of religion. Growing up in a Pentecostal church in inner city Brooklyn. Growing up in a diversity of religions and cultures all around me. And also a Nepantla in terms of what we do when we do the academic work, where our voices are still, many of them, still as footnotes. So I am delighted to be here with you because I think that if anyone understands Nepantla, it is the people of the church. Because the church is a Nepantla place. It is an in-between that helps people to navigate and to negotiate the realities of life. You know that I am Cuban-American. I was born in Cuba, raised in New York City, but there's some things to add to that. I don't drink coffee. I don't like baseball. I never voted Republican. I never lived in Miami. So, sorry, but that makes me even more Nepantla. My father keeps on saying to me, how could you be my daughter and not drink coffee? Who knew? We have gathered at this event to, as the Advocacy Days website clearly states, to worship, to dialogue, so as to be inspired and equipped to speak boldly on behalf of people-centered, sustainable development and economic justice, physical safety, security and peacemaking with a particular focus on those most impacted, women, girls, and families. There will be wonderful, well-informed speakers during this event, each presenting a particular perspective that would help to solidify the knowledge base of this group as you seek to speak to the powers that be about the great need that exists in this nation for policies regarding economic development, that they not only be people-centered, but also clearly consider the issues of justice and peace, particularly as they relate to women, young girls, and their families. I have been asked this day to start the conversation with a theological perspective, and so I want to speak to you about embodied justice and why it is especially important given the reality of sustainability. So we'll talk about that economic policy, but also about female bodies, which is why I want to focus your attention on the femicide as well as the eco-side, the nature, the body of creation that is happening right now along the U.S.-Mexico border. And I want to talk about the border, not so much in terms of the immigration piece, but in terms of the degradation of life that is happening there that is reflective of our policies of this nation towards Mexico and Latin America, especially with NAFTA and CAFTA. Let me begin by inviting you to reflect with me about the feminist theological voices that as early as the 1960s began to connect the destruction and violence done to the earth, similar with the violence done to women in U.S. society. Theologians like Rosemary Ruther and those that quickly followed her, like Elizabeth Dodson Gray, Sally McFaig, Elizabeth Johnson, and others, became prominent women's theological voices who challenged patriarchy and its views on the female and earth bodies, views which these theologians believed led to abuse, degradation, violence, and destruction. To these voices were added a rising generation of women theologians from around the world, including the well-known Ivone Guevara from Brazil, who writes and lectures about the issues of ecological violence in women's bodies in the context of Latin America and migration. What are these women fighting against? What were these women fighting against? And what theological connections are they making that are important to the work that you are doing? As we can see from these two quotes that I have on the screen, you will see from these quotes, the first one by 19th century German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach and by cultural critic Wendell Berry, the reason why many believe that Christianity is at fault for the current ecological crisis is the emphasis within the Christian tradition on dualisms of body and soul, spiritual and material, sacred and secular, which denigrates the earth and sanctions its misuse and exploitation. Certainly, these dualisms still maintain their hold on our Christian discourse, and when combined with the eschatological hope that so many U.S. Christian churches hold, in which a second coming of Christ will completely bring forth a new heaven and a new earth, this unexamined and uncritical eschatological hope, in essence, negates any rationale for taking care of the earth in the here and the now. If we look to history for a critical analysis of the relationship between Christianity and ecology, we must consider the work of Lynn White Jr., a professor of medieval history. In his well-known 1967 essay entitled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, White argues that by emphasizing humanity's transcendence over nature and by desacralizing nature, Christianity made possible the growth of modern science and technology, which in turn led to uncontrolled power over nature. Using a historical lens, White linked the ethos of medieval Christianity to the emergence of what he called an exploitative attitude toward nature in the Western world. But where do these ideas come from? Is it correct to blame Christianity and to lay it at the foot of Christianity? I believe that in seeking our answers, we can look to the philosophers of the Greek world and to the great influence not only on Western Enlightenment thought, but also on the New Testament ethos. Consider the ideas of nature that were present in the ancient Greek world, which were varied, and though even if they cannot be generalized, when we look at Plato and Aristotle, we see that because of their understanding of the relationship of humans to the world, which so greatly influenced Western culture, there developed this idea of a hierarchical dualism, a characteristic of this type of philosophy. So we can say that the current challenges that threaten the kind of policies that we have, that threaten our ecological environment, at the heart of these challenges lie a spiritual and a theological problem. And while we cannot deny that these issues have technological, political, economic, and social dimensions, we must also recognize that the root cause of the exploiting, poisoning, and degrading of the earth comes from the way in which humans imagine themselves in relation to the natural world. Surely we can trace the way humans understand themselves in relation to nature to Aristotelian thought, which in many ways continues the Platonic ideas about a hierarchy of ordering the created world in which humans are placed and above all of creation. For Aristotle, plants are created for animals and animals exist for humans. Seems this way, plants and animals are directly related to the needs and uses of humans, and therefore nature is to be regarded and treated as a resource for human utility. In this kind of thinking, the purpose of the created world is directed to humans, who are the rational animals, and it is this intelligence that justifies the actions that humans take to use nature to fulfill their own purposes. The focus on human intelligence is found in Plato, from which is derived the notion of a contemptus mundi, a contempt for the world. This idea is that humans are the ones that will bring order to a chaotic nature, yet humans always remain alien to nature. Taking this idea and this kind of philosophical movement towards the idea of humans and power, humans in relation to nature, and humans imagining themselves, feminist theologian Elizabeth Dodson Gray calls these hierarchical relationships the anthropocentric illusion, which is what you see on the slide. And we can see here the diagram that she proposes in her book, Green Paradise Lost. Gray says, many theologians today remind us that dominion can mean responsible stewardship, but it is clear that however dominion is interpreted, it always means above and implies a right to exercise power over others. This type of imagination is dangerous to nature because in endorsing mastery and control over nature, it objectifies nature and thus allows for the exploitation of nature. And it is in understanding this anthropocentric illusion, this imagination of dominion, that we also come to understand how dangerous this same imagination is to women and children, especially to girls. Gray makes this observation. What is clearly articulated here is a hierarchical order of being in which the lower orders, whether female or child or animal or plant, can be treated, mistreated, violated, sold, sacrificed, or killed at the convenience of the higher states of spiritual being found in males and in God. Gray's critique of this anthropocentric illusion and her rereading of the Genesis 1 creation story is one of the many ways that feminist theologians have engaged, not only in the work and talking about ecological degradation, but also in talking about violence against women. Rosemary Ruther was one of the first Christian theologians to perceive clearly and to articulate forcefully the interconnectedness between liberation theology and the theology of nature, and was making these connections as early as the late 1960s. Like Gray, Ruther has also made the connections between the domination of nature and the domination of women. In 1972, Ruther wrote Mother Earth and the Mega Machine, in which she said, "Women have also been identified with nature, the earth, and the body in its despised and rejected form. To simply reject this identification would be to neglect that part of ourselves we have been left to cultivate, and to buy into the very polarization of which we have been the primary victims. The significance of our movement," she says, "will be lost if we merely seek valued masculine traits at the expense of devalued feminine ones. Women must be the spokesman for a new humanity arising out of the reconciliation of spirit and body. Women must be the spokesman for a new humanity." This is such a powerful statement, what we're saying. How women in the church, how the church can claim this need for the reconciliation between spirit and body. What we have here is an appeal to a theology that is embodied. What we have here is an appeal to the works of justice and mercy that are embodied, that does not leave matters about God, philosophy, theology, or morality, or ethics to an abstract intellect in the hand of theologians who produce work that how many do we really read? Come on, we have to be clear about that. I always ask myself, what am I writing this for? Who's going to read this? This book is going to be sold for $1 in 6 months. What's the point? So it's not about that. You know, we're so driven to get this. Well, this is not what we have to always do. Yeah, we think it's up here. But the call is for us to embody what we believe, to take these ideas, these philosophies, to be critical, and then to say, how is my body going to work with this for justice and mercy in this world? Ruther's theological work is further expanded by theologian Sally McPhee, who says the following: "Who I am and who God is are taken for granted in culture." Is that true or not? But it is precisely the false conventional views of God and ourselves that permit the continuing destruction of our planets and its inhabitants. The environmental crisis is a theological problem coming from views of God and ourselves that encourage or permits our destructive and unjust actions. What McPhee points out is the need for theologians, women and men of all races and cultures, to be the ones to lead the conversation about these two central questions that McPhee highlights about our theologies and our anthropologies. She reminds us that it is useless to censure people for their actions when the roots of those actions lie in deep, unexamined assumptions. And the first step in this examination of assumptions is to promote a communitarian view of human beings. McFaig says that if God is always incarnate, if God is always in us and we are in God, then Christians should attend to the model of the world as God's body. The model of the world as God's body helps us understand that the doctrine of creation is not about God's power, but about God's love. How we can live together, all of us, within and for God's body. It focuses our attention on the near, on the neighbor, on the earth, on meeting God not later in heaven, but here and now. We meet God in the world and especially in the flesh of the world. It is the practical dimension of this theological proposal that is so very important for us and for the work that you are doing. While humans do not occupy a special place in creation, but are an intrinsic part of it, they are given the task of caretakers. They are called to help the body in all its dimensions and manifestations to flourish. In order to do this, McFaig says that humans have to become ecologically literate, which means understanding the earth's most basic law, that there is no way the whole earth can flourish unless all hearts are cared for. Ecological literacy, as defined by McFaig, is all about community. It is all about interconnectedness and interdependence in the broadest and most comprehensive of ways, so that we are able to widen our perspective, we are able to embrace others, and we are able to embrace the earth. When we do this, we return to a more fundamental and functional anthropology, one that sees human life embedded in and dependent on the world in which we live. It is a rejection of the cult of individualism that, since the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment, has overtaken our sense of responsibility for the care of creation, as well as our obligations towards other people, especially oppressed or poor people. Ruther also argues for a cosmic covenant that points to a coherent oneness of creation that is at its core about the interdependence of all living things in global community. Like McFaig, Ruther argues for a vision of reciprocal interdependence that is about solidarity with other humans and Mother Earth, in which we are all grounded. The idea here is all about embodied justice. Embodied justice is when we honor the bodies of others, when we see the body of others as the creation that is connected to us, interconnected to us, so that when we honor the bodies of others, we are also drawn into God's work. The work of justice is honoring the bodies of others. When we honor the bodies of others, we are also drawn into God's work. It is clear from our faith that everything has to do how we live as embodied people. As we look south to the work of Latin American feminist theologians, we find a continuation of the ideas of Ruther and McFaig, but we also find new and key ideas that reflect the context in which Latin American ecofeminists are engaged. Yvonne Guevara, who is a religious sister and a member of the Canonicity of St. Augustine, is author of Longing for Running Water, Ecofeminism and Liberation. As a self-described nomad, she travels throughout Latin America giving courses and workshops on feminist and ecofeminist theology to grassroots community, women's groups, religious groups, and solidarity organizations. She has chosen to live in a slum, in a favela outside of Recife, in northeastern Brazil. Her theology has been constructed from the daily life of her neighbors, most of whom are poor women. Silenced by Rome in 1994 for what the Vatican considered unorthodox opinions, she was told to return to school, as all good women should, right? Go back to school. And she was told to return to school at a Pontifical Catholic University in Europe. Guevara chose Louvain, where she completed a second doctorate. There you go. And a second book. There you go again. Which was called Out of the Depths, Women's Experience of Evil and Salvation in 2002. Like other theologians, feminist theologians, Guevara joins in questioning the religious hierarchy of the church. She continues questioning those in power in society. She continues questioning those favored by history, those as she has identified as the rich, the white, and the male. Like Ruther and McFaig, Guevara not only challenges the underlying patriarchal structure of Christianity and of society, but also casts a critical eye on economic structures, and she examines these in the context of the global south, of Latin America, where poverty, violence, and immigration are closely linked. In her book, Longings for Running Water, Guevara says the following: with ecofeminism, I have begun to see more clearly how exclusion of the poor is linked to the destruction of their lands, to the forces that leave them no choice but to move from place to place in a ceaseless exile, to racism, and to the growth of militarization of their countries. They arm themselves to kill the poor. I sense that ecofeminism is born of daily life, of day-to-day sharing among people, garbage in the streets, bad smells, the absence of sewers and safe drinking water, poor nutrition and adequate health care. This is no new ideology. Rather, it is a different perception of reality that starts right from the unjust system in which we find ourselves. Guevara begins to work in the midst of the pain and the struggle. She also holds to the fundamental relatedness of the human condition, and she argues that an ecofeminist ethics seeks to open spaces for women and for the Earth's ecosystems to assume their rightful place in the building of new relationships built on respect and reciprocity. She insists that an ethics of life aims at creating a society in which every person and every species has a right to life within a collectivity because each one has a vital need for the other. The fact that all of creation, humans, animals, plants, have this profound interrelatedness is for Guevara an invitation to a Christology of gratitude, which she defines as a capacity to contemplate gratefully the mysterious beauty that surrounds us, to feel our common belonging to the same universe. I don't know about you, but when Patrick was leading us this morning, I began to feel how interconnected we are. We were one voice, one human voice before the eternal. Something so profound and so deep when we begin to really understand and see ourselves this way. And this means that I've got to talk about money, doesn't it? Because we have to turn our attention to the issue of economics, which is ultimately about examining how it is that we really live and act in the world. Remembering the words of John Sobrino, theologian from El Salvador, who said, "Day to day, the death-dealing reality of poverty is the world's most serious wound." It is notable, says Sally McFay, that none of the world's major religions has as its maxim, "Blessed are the greedy." Even though some church members really would like that to happen, I know. Really, it's unbelievable. I got to tell you this story. I know I'm taking time, but I got to tell you this story. When we were pastor developers in Texas, we did a new church start in Houston, and we were evicted from 6 buildings in 18 months. This is what's called nesting in the Disciples Church. And in one of the buildings that we were asked to leave because we were other, when we had a meeting because the regional minister wanted to know, well, what's going on? Why are you kicking them out? A man got up and said, "If I would have known that I started giving money to this church in 1953 would have been for some Mexicans, I want my money back." This is what I'm talking about. How we don't connect money to, we talk about the earth, ecology, one connectedness, but we don't talk about the pocketbook and its connection to one another. So, it is notable, says Sally McFeig, that none of the world's major religions has as its maxim, "Blessed are the greedy," right? However, while some people in the church still cling to the belief that religions have nothing to do with economics, I was at Wake Forest 3 weeks ago, and I had people come up to me and tell me, "You mean that really? This is a connection we can make?" I thought, what century am I in? What is going on with this conversation, all right? That belief that religion has nothing to do with economics. The bottom line is that religion is about human well-being, about life and death issues, about quality of life. And not just the quality of life, but of the planet and the creation as well. Here is what McFeig says. To be sure, Christians do not openly support the maxim, "Blessed are the greedy." Nonetheless, this is the way most of us live. Why? Quite simply because we are members of a society, now a worldwide one, that accepts almost without question an economic theory that supports insatiable greed on the part of individuals, regardless of its consequences to other people or to the planet. This assumption lies behind present-day market capitalism, and since the death of communism and the decline of socialism, it has been accepted by most people as a description of the way things are and must be. It is the truth. So she proposes this model, the idea of ecological economics, oikos. In McFeig's model, she sees this is a model of the world as the oikos, or the house that we all share. If we look at this kind of economics as Christians, we begin to understand that we inhabit this house. All of us inhabit this house. We are all part of this household. And when we talk about economics and how money is spent and how nations make policies that have to do with money, we're talking about house rules. that make it possible for the management of resources in such a way that all people of the oikos can survive and thrive. But what happens when it seems that the house rules no longer matter? And we've seen that a lot in the last few years, haven't we? What happens when death and violence become the accepted behavior of the house? What happens when greed is taken for granted? What happens when the body of women begin to litter the very earth that day by day becomes more poison and deadly? What happens when the Mother Earth and her daughters become the victims of patriarchy, hierarchy, and economics? This is the current reality in the industrial city of Ciudad Juarez, in the state of Chihuahua in northern Mexico, a city adjacent to El Paso, and the site of the murder of approximately more than 400 girls, young women, that began in 1993, though the numbers are contested. These deaths have been called femicide, which is a systemic killing of women due to their gender. This slide shows the poster created by Chicana artist Alma Matos for the 2003 conference sponsored by the UCLA Chicano Research Center to examine the many layers of reality that contributed to and keep invisible the deaths of hundreds of young women and girls in Ciudad Juarez right across the border. This poster shows a version of Coyoshwaki, who is the Aztec warrior moon goddess, who was brutally dismembered by her brother Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, for rising against patriarchy. Here is a more traditional rendering of the goddess. In this image, you see the moon goddess lying in pieces, which serves as a reminder of the female bodies dumped along the desert fringes of Ciudad Juarez, many bearing signs of rape, torture, and mutilation. The bodies found were of women from their early teens to their 30s, and while not all of them worked in the numerous maquiladoras that have been a part of the border landscape for more than 40 years, it is estimated that about 1/3 of the women killed were indeed employed by the assembly plants. Others were students. A number had recently migrated to Juarez from other areas of Mexico. A little-known fact is that at least 6 of the slain women were U.S. citizens of Mexican descent from El Paso, Texas, Las Cruces, New Mexico, and one was from the Netherlands and another from Honduras. In Mexico, the maquiladora worker is typically someone with little education or property and is often migrant from even poorer region of the country, which now hosts a conglomerate of factories owned by European, American, Korean, Dutch, Japanese multinational corporations. Thousands of these workers eke out sad lives in shanty towns without water, electricity, or public lighting. Authorities have never identified who is behind these murders, though theories range from serial killers to gangs to satanic cults to organ harvesting to drug trafficking. A very flawed justice system has failed to respond, leaving families with a sense that there will never be justice for their missing daughters, and it has been the effort of activists who gather in Ciudad Juarez to continue to push the authority to respond and who support the families of the disappeared or murdered women in keeping their memories alive and their faces in the public eye. This was an event that was done this very year in Juarez. In 2001, the release of the documentary Señorita Extraviada by filmmaker and former Juarez resident Lourdes Portillo, the public discourse on these murders has intensified. As the camera in the documentary shows the various crime scenes and the audience gets the chance to see littered clothing, shoes, jewelry, tossed pocketbooks with pictures of the family and friends of these young victims, we cannot help but be overcome with vehement rage. But because I want to emphasize the need to connect religion and economics, the need to discover and call out the importance of developing a feminist eco-theology that makes clear the connections between systemic violence against women and uncontained neoliberal economic policies, I want to turn my attention to examining the globalization of the Mexican border. Ciudad Juarez is Mexico's 5th largest city. It is home to 1.5 million people. The city also has the dubious distinction of being Mexico's maquila capital, home in 2004 to 300 factories and more than 200,000 workers, more than half of whom are women. The unspoken element in the discourse is multinational corporations' complicity with Mexican officials in disregarding the health, the safety, and security needs of the Mexican women and girls who work in these plants. Juarez, like many border towns affected by NAFTA, may have factories and cheap jobs, but such employment has not enhanced peace and prosperity among the working class. The undeveloped point that surrounds the phenomenon of the murders is the fact that every girl whose body was found mutilated and dumped has worked hard, very hard, in one of these factories. She was trying to improve her life as well as that of her family. Yet the reality is also that none of these female maquiladora workers had access to public security, and despite the millions in annual profits made by these corporations, these workers continue to live in dire poverty and to earn minimum wages that amount to $5 to $7 per day. Here is just for you to have a sense of what maquiladora economics looks like. And when I'm talking about this, I see this very much as a reality for our country because we benefit so much from the maquiladora industry. And NAFTA was so carefully crafted to move product, but not to move people, and has created a tremendous problem we have with immigration. The majority of the 1 million maquiladora workers are female, 14 to 25 in age. The productivity is incredible, but look, workers earn $5 to $7 a day despite profits of $119 billion that were generated in '99. That number has changed, of course. However, the cost of living in border towns in southern Mexico is 30% higher than it is, border towns are 30% higher than in southern Mexico. A 2000 study showed that a maquiladora worker had to work 4 hours to buy 2 pounds of beans, 11 hours and 30 minutes to buy a box of diapers. And when I've been traveling with my students since 1994 to the border, and you'll see that them take out they'll wash them, they'll clean them. This is the kind of people, this kind of community, the kind of desperation we're looking at. And they have to work 4 hours and 17 minutes to buy a gallon of milk. These women represent unskilled maquiladora labor, and as such, they are vulnerable to sexual harassment and assault. The lack of government regulation to protect workers, especially women, contributes to an environment that is hostile and includes discrimination, exposure to dangerous chemicals, and arbitrary disciplinary methods. Through the years, in taking my students to the border since 1994, as I have said, I've heard dozens of stories of female maquiladoras tell me of having to take pregnancy tests when they get to work in the morning, or being asked to submit to unscheduled physical examinations that require them to take off their clothes. I've also met a number of women who have been exposed to toxic chemicals for so many years that they have developed all kinds of illnesses, and some of them have died. It is clear that the global production plant is more important than the worker, and the worker is so devalued is that the worker is seen as expendable. If we look at the bodies of the slain women, we're going to see the following. One of the questions raised in the media, as well as by some in the community, is about whether the murder victims were prostitutes, dutiful daughters, dedicated mothers, women leading double lives, or responsible workers. In other words, were they good girls? And this is something that we have to really think about, because this also happens in this country all the time. The fact that Mexico's industrialization has certainly changed traditional gender roles in which men were the sole breadwinners and gave women the opportunity to leave their homes for work, these changes need to be considered. Even though their wages are meager, very young women are earning and spending money. Many have moved away from their rural homes and are living on their own without direct paternal or male supervision. Not only have women workers changed the perception of workers in general, but their status as workers has also changed how men relate to women. Susan Faludi's book, Backlash, written in 1991, dealt with these very issues, and she showed how men, angered by what they perceived as women's cheapening of wages, reacted to women with violence, particularly intimate violence, rape, and sex-related murders. For some scholars and researchers, the violence in Juarez can be understood in this way. However, I think there is another more complex and nuanced way of examining these perceptions about whether or not the victims were good girls. The targets of the Juarez crimes were not güeras del norte, which means light-skinned girls from the north. But they were muchachas del sur, girls from the south, who in the patriarchal eyes of their society turned into maquilocas. Interesting term, right? Living la vida loca. Women who think that they are independent because they work in a maquila when all they really are is so far from God and so close to the U.S. According to popular misconception, a maquiloca is a maquiladora worker who, as a result of her close contact with the libertine ways of El Norte, tries to behave like an American, loses her good girl morality and therefore her value as a woman, drinks alcohol and uses drugs, gets pregnant, and is asking for trouble and usually finds it. In this seemingly archaic patriarchal worldview, women's sexual desire and the desire she provokes in men has to be controlled and monitored and even punished. In these horrific, violent, and brutal crimes, we can find the hate of the poor, brown, female bodies. These women's bodies had in some way transgressed, had in some way defied the social construction of their gender when her role changed from daughter or sister to household provider, and in so doing she was given dubious reputation and ultimately devalued. Ciudad Juarez is a geographical space that has become for women a geography of danger. But in this femicide, we are also confronted with gendered and racialized boundaries of citizenship. Because of their gender, the women killed have not received the protection of their governments. They have not been protected from exploitation and abuse by powerful multinationals in their place of work. They have not been given the security of living wages, of adequate housing, adequate medical care, and they have not been given security to protect them from a violent patriarchal culture. And because the bodies of the women killed in Juarez lack the social capital of women with money, education, and privilege, the victims were blamed for their deaths as authorities and neighbors questioned if they had been good girls. While the call is for justice for the women of Juarez, here is a drawing by Laura Molina. And here in it we see the Guadalupe holding not the body of her son, but the broken body of a woman killed in Juarez. The reality is that for the work still to be done, there needs to be a closer and more critical look at femicide as a growing ecological failure, not just on the border, but here in our country as well. It is a failure of the oikos, the global human community, to protect and to care for its women. Femicide is a concern not only in Juarez, but also in other countries in Latin America. In Guatemala, between 2000 to 2007, 3,000 women have been murdered, their bodies showing signs of having been treated with hatred and cruelty. If we agree with Sally McFaig that all theology is anthropology, and that religions are in the business of forming the imagination and thus influencing the actions of people, then one of the crucial tasks that must be attended to by theologians and by people of the church must be attended by the theologians and people of the church is to examine and to cry against the widely accepted 21st century capitalist objectification of the world and its inhabitants. It is not only workers who are objectified and valued only for how much they can produce, as is the case of the maquiladora industry, but the idea that the world exists to satisfy the needs and desires and to bring pleasure to those with power and privilege, this deadly idea has to be continuously and tirelessly attacked. As eco-theologians continue to work on recognizing the body of the world and nature, the prophetic dimension of this work demands that human bodies, especially those bodies that are seen as other, who lack social worth because of gender, skin color, class, must also be lifted up. There cannot be talk of sustainable economic practices that do not exploit both humans and nature without talking about we treat those who enter our borders without documentation. This nation is eager to employ and exploit the non-documented worker, but this nation is also very reluctant to acknowledge the contributions these same workers make not only to our economy, but to the fact that they sustain the kind of lifestyle we enjoy in this country. An important part of the theological work that you are doing this weekend is a work of advocacy on behalf of those who are demeaned, abused, exploited, criminalized because they are identified as illegal. Yet as Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel reminds us, no human being is illegal. We are all part of the oikos, the household of God. and the desire to have a safe southern border, because there does not seem to be much concern about the northern border, does not give us a rationale to hunt down immigrants from helicopters, as Kansas Republican State Representative Virgil Peck suggested just a few weeks ago. Not only do we say to Representative Peck, shame on you, but we want to remind him, oh, I'm so angry, we want to remind him that there are many, many Americans in this country, many here today, who are offended by this kind of rhetoric, and we will not be silent. Oh. We will not be silent. We will not be silent to this kind of offensive rhetoric, violent speech. We are all part of the oikos. We all are members of the household of God. Liberation theology gives us a method to proceed. See, judge, and act. I trust God. And I trust the community of God. And I trust that God will give each of you the wisdom, the power, and the love, so that you embody the work of justice, mercy, and compassion, and go out into the world to make a difference. Thank you.